we are going to be talking about World War II and the key players and key events that happened in World War II. How bad was it really? We've all heard stories about World War II. We've heard about the Holocaust, but we're going to really dive into the details of it today. Before we get into World War II, however, we have to look at the outcomes of World War I. Before we go any further, I want you to write down from the top of your head a couple of consequences the Germans had after World War I. All right, hopefully you got one or two. The World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles, and what came out of that was Germany having to pay many reparations, a lot of money to their enemies during the war. They had to give up their territories that they had conquered during World War I, like Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Their army was limited to 100,000 men, and their navy vessels were under 100,000 tons. And they had to also accept all responsibility for the war. So they had to say, it was our bad, we did it, we won't do it again. But as we know, that is not true. Another reason World War II started to heat up, what caused conflict before World War II, was the Great Depression in America. Although it happened in America, it affected the whole world, but it was caused by a stock market crash in the US. People would take out loans and banks could not repay them, or they would lose their savings because the banks would give them out to other people for loans. It left 13 million unemployed in America. That was an unemployment rate of 25%, which means that 1 in 4 households had no income at all. Now we're going to talk about the key players in World War II. You had the Allied forces versus the Axis powers. So the Allied forces most notably were the UK, the United States, the Soviet Union, and France was for some time until Germany had invaded, and then France was helpless. They could not do anything. The Soviet Union also used to be a part of the Axis powers before World War II and at the beginning. However, Germany betrayed them, so they switched sides and helped us defeat the Nazis in Italy and Japan. All right. Now, the war had been going on for 2 years. It started in 1939. Germany made many advances in France and other European nations. The US had been cautious to enter a war that they knew would be destructive and costly, so they were very hesitant to join. They were just supplying sides with weapons and financial help. But Pearl Harbor changed that on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese bombed a naval base in Hawaii. 2,000 U.S. soldiers died, 1,000 were wounded, and officially brought the U.S. into World War II 2 years after the conflict began. Another big issue that happened during World War II was the Holocaust. You see this gate right here. It says something in German, so here's a question. I want you to write down what those words mean in English. Write down the translation of those words and bring them to class with you, and we'll talk about them later on. You can guess, or you can look it up, see if you were right. The prisoners during the Holocaust were brought to the concentration and labor camps in cattle cars that you see on the left, and they were given barely any food to stay alive. As you can see on the right, they were all very skinny. All of their heads were shaved. They were given numbers as tattoos on their arms. Right when entering the concentration camps, they may have been sent to the gas chambers and then they would have been killed there, or they were forced to work under terrible conditions with barely any food, a terrible shelter packed in bunk beds. And we have a quote from Anne Frank on the bottom. I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. This was written during World War II. Anne Frank had written it. It just goes to show a child's innocence during World War II. Here's a graph of all of the deaths during World War II. The bottom horizontal axis shows what group of people died during the Holocaust, and the vertical axis shows how many. So the biggest number are the Jewish population, obviously, with about 6 million. There have also been numbers higher than that, but that's just a rough estimate. There were also almost 2 million non-Jewish Poles. Once Germany invaded Poland, they took out all the people there, and also about 3 million Soviet Union prisoners of war. As well as people with disabilities, they were found in the institutions and killed there. Or gypsies, which are just people who traveled around. They never really had an official place that they lived, or the Serbians. All those were low numbers, but when you add them all up, it's a pretty high number. D-Day is one of the most famous events from World War II. It occurred on June 6, 1944. It's when the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. About 160,000 troops, including 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircrafts. They fought back and defeated the Nazis. Although D-Day ended in a victory for Allied forces, many lives were lost throughout the war. D-Day was just one of very many battles in Europe, and here are some letters from soldiers about their accounts during World War II. After the Nazis had been defeated, Hitler committed suicide, but the Japanese were still not giving up, so the US decided, and President Truman decided, to use the nuclear bombs we had been working on in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th, we dropped the first bomb. It was the world's first atomic bomb in Hiroshima. This bomb wiped out 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. However, tens of thousands would later die because of radioactive exposure. On August 9th, we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, which did about the same damage. And finally, the Japanese emperor said, "Enough is enough, we give up." And the war was over. Now we're going to look at the total military lives lost of just the key players. The Soviet Union lost the most, with approximately 8 to 10 million. Again, no one can be sure the exact number. And then you have a close second of Germany with about 5.5 million. The UK and United States, relatively compared to Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, did not lose that many, as well as France and Italy. Both of them did not lose as many soldiers as their counterparts. Some good things did come out of World War II. Because of all of the men in the United States having to go over and fight the war because of the draft, women and minorities were brought into the workforce to make weapons and planes and tanks. Also, the American economy started booming. The Great Depression had ruined it, but because of our sales of weapons and loans given to other countries, our economy started to be on the up and up after World War II. Also, obviously, the Nazis were defeated, as well as the other Axis powers, which was a victory for democracy around the world. However, as with all wars, peace does not last long. World War II, they called the Great War. It was called the War to End All Wars. And then World War II came. And after World War II, you had a communist Soviet Union that was very powerful versus the United States, both two great powers in the world. Although they never had a real war against each other, they had a Cold War conflict from the 1940s until 1991, so about 50 years, which included during that time the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all fighting against communism because after World War II, a bunch of countries were starting to break away from colonization and imperialism by Western powers, and they were trying to figure out their own method of government. And the US and Soviet Union were fighting over if they wanted these countries to be communist or democratic. So, as with all wars, peace did not last long. And so we need to look at that, looking at today's wars. What can we do to stop future ones? I want you now to write down 2 questions you may have for me, bring them in, and we will talk about them at the beginning of class.